Welcome to Ghost Files, where every whisper hides a secret, and every story could be real. Before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because you never know which story might be waiting for you next. Turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and get ready, because tonight's story might follow you, even after it ends. Story 1. The Man Next Door Who Knew Everything. Location: suburban Columbus, Ohio, 2018. Rachel and Mike Donovan had been married for 4 years when they bought their first house, a 3-bedroom colonial on a quiet street in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio. It was everything they had wanted: good school district for the future, a backyard large enough for a garden, a neighborhood where people mowed their lawns and waved from driveways and left holiday decorations up a few weeks longer than they should have. They moved in on a Saturday in April, and by Sunday afternoon, their next-door neighbor had come over to introduce himself. His name was Frank. He was in his mid-60s, retired, living alone in the house he had owned for over 20 years. He was the kind of neighbor that first-time homeowners hope for. He brought over a bottle of wine, told them a little about the neighborhood, pointed out which streets flooded in heavy rain, mentioned that the Italian place 2 blocks over was worth the wait on Friday nights. He was warm and helpful and specific in a way that communicated genuine investment in the neighborhood. Rachel liked him immediately. Mike thought he was a little much, but said nothing because the wine was good, and Frank was leaving soon, and first impressions of neighbors were worth protecting. The relationship started normally. Frank waved from his driveway. He occasionally had a brief conversation over the fence when one of them was gardening. He brought over tomatoes from his garden in late summer without being asked, just a bag left on the porch with a note. He was the kind of presence that made a neighborhood feel like a neighborhood rather than a collection of adjacent strangers. The first thing that made Rachel uncomfortable happened about 3 months in. She had been at the grocery store on a Tuesday morning and had run into Frank in the produce section. He was friendly, and they spoke briefly. On her way out, he mentioned that she must have finished her errands early today. She was usually back by 11 on Tuesdays. She smiled and said something vague and went to her car and sat for a moment. She was usually back by 11 on Tuesdays. She thought about her Tuesdays. She did her grocery run on Tuesday mornings, usually leaving around 9 and returning by 11. This was true. She had not mentioned this to Frank. She had not mentioned her schedule to Frank at all. She told herself he was observant in the way that retired people who spent a lot of time at home became observant. She told herself it was a small thing. She put it away and did not mention it to Mike. 2 weeks later, Frank mentioned to Mike over the fence that Mike's morning run had been earlier than usual that day. Did he have something on at work? Mike laughed it off in the moment, and then came inside and mentioned it to Rachel with a slight frown. They both paused on it for a moment, and then the conversation moved on. But Rachel started paying attention. Over the following 2 months, she cataloged, quietly and without telling Mike fully, the things Frank referenced in passing that he should not have known. The time she took a phone call in the backyard and the general topic of the conversation, he referenced it obliquely 2 days later in a way that made her stomach drop. The fact that she had been unwell for a few days in October. She had not left the house and had not spoken to Frank, and he mentioned hoping she was feeling better when she emerged on the 4th day. The specific day and approximate time that a friend had visited. Frank mentioned it had been nice to see she had company. She started being deliberate about what she did in and around the house. She closed blinds she had previously left open. She stopped taking phone calls in the backyard. She was aware, in a specific and uncomfortable way, that the house next door had a clear sight line to several windows on the side of their house that faced Frank's property. She mentioned it to Mike in November, not as alarm, as a conversation. Mike listened and agreed it was a little odd, but said Frank was just an observant guy, and retirement left people with a lot of time to notice things. He said it was harmless. Rachel did not fully agree, but she let it rest. In December, something happened that she could not let rest. She had been going through some personal health issues, nothing life-threatening but significant enough that she had been to the doctor twice in 1 week and had been on the phone with her mother and her sister in emotional conversations that she had taken in the bedroom with the door closed. She had not mentioned any of it to Frank. She had not mentioned it to anyone outside her immediate family and her doctor. Frank knocked on the door on a Thursday evening with a small poinsettia. He handed it to Rachel and said, "I hope things are looking up with your health. Just a small thing to brighten the house." He smiled and left. Rachel closed the door and stood in the hallway holding the poinsettia and did not move for a full minute. She went upstairs to the bedroom where she had taken the phone calls. She looked at the window. It faced directly toward Frank's house, toward a second-floor window of Frank's house that she had never paid particular attention to before. She turned the light off and stood at the dark window and looked at Frank's second-floor window. There was a light on, and in the window, a shape. The shape of a person standing back from the glass, not visible in detail, but present. She went downstairs and told Mike everything. Not the edited, careful version she had been carrying for months. Everything. Mike listened this time without minimizing it. When she got to the poinsettia and the health comment in the window, he was quiet for a long time. They bought blackout curtains for every window facing Frank's property the following weekend. Rachel removed all personal information from any social media that listed their address. They bought a security system with cameras covering the exterior of their property. They were polite to Frank at the fence, and nothing more. Frank continued being exactly as he had always been. Warm, friendly, specific, leaving tomatoes on the porch in summer, waving from the driveway. Nothing he did was illegal. Nothing he did was overtly threatening. He was a retired man who knew more about his neighbors than they had told him. They sold the house 2 years later. The decision was not entirely because of Frank, but it was not entirely unrelated to Frank either. On moving day, Frank came over and helped carry boxes to the truck without being asked. He said he was sorry to see them go. He said they had been good neighbors. Rachel thanked him. She shook his hand. She got in the car and did not look back at his house as they pulled away. She says the thing that has stayed with her most in the years since, the thing she thinks about when she thinks about Frank, is not any specific incident. It is the cumulative experience of living beside a person who knew the texture of her daily life in intimate detail and had never once asked her for any of it. She says the most unsettling kind of surveillance is the kind that never announces itself, the kind that looks exactly like a friendly neighbor who brings tomatoes and waves from the driveway and always somehow knows when you have been unwell. She says she thinks about the window, the shape of a person standing back from the glass in a dark second-floor room in December, and she thinks about all the other evenings she had not thought to look. The family across the fence. Location: rural Tennessee, 2020. Dana and Paul Erickson moved to a 5-acre property in rural Tennessee in the spring of 2020. They were both in their late 30s, both working remotely, both deliberately leaving behind a decade of city living in Nashville for something quieter and more spacious. They wanted land. They wanted silence. They wanted the particular freedom that comes from not sharing walls with anyone. They had done their research, visited the property 3 times before buying, walked the boundaries, met the listing agent, felt good about the decision. What they had not fully accounted for was the family on the adjacent property. The Holt family, A couple in their 50s named Earl and Donna and their adult son Travis, who lived with them, owned the 30 acres that bordered the eastern side of the Ericksons' property, along a fence line of old cedar posts and rusted wire. Their house was about 200 yards from the fence and partially obscured by a stand of old cedars. Dana had seen it from their property when she walked the fence line on the first week. A dark 2-story farmhouse with a metal roof and a porch that wrapped around the front. She had waved once at a figure she thought she saw on the porch. The figure had not waved back. The first direct interaction came in their second week. Paul was clearing brush near the fence line in the late afternoon when Travis Holt appeared on the other side. Travis was in his late 20s, large, with the kind of still, unsmiling face that is hard to read. He told Paul directly, "We don't want anyone clearing near our fence line." Paul said he was clearing on his side of the fence. Travis said he could see that. He said he still did not want it. He stood there for a moment and then walked back toward the Holt house without further conversation. Paul came inside and told Dana. They agreed Travis was probably just territorial about the property boundary, common enough in rural areas, and decided to give the fence line a wide berth to avoid conflict. Over the following weeks, the Holts established their presence in ways that were difficult to specifically object to, but consistently uncomfortable. Earl drove his tractor along the fence line every few days, slowly, facing the Erickson property as he drove. Donna hung laundry on a line that faced their shared fence in clear view of Dana's kitchen window and watched the Erickson house while she worked. Travis appeared at the fence line at irregular intervals, never saying anything unless approached, just standing and looking at their property with that same still, unreadable expression. Dana began feeling watched in her own yard. She mentioned it to a neighbor down the road, a woman named Carol, who had lived in the area for 30 years. And Carol's reaction was not the dismissive reassurance Dana had half expected. Carol got quiet and then said, "The Holts are particular about their neighbors." Dana asked what that meant. Carol said she wasn't sure how to explain it, other than to say that everyone who shared a fence line with the Holts eventually either became very good friends with them or had problems. She said the ones who had problems had a tendency to move. Dana asked how many neighbors had moved. Carol said she could think of 3 families in the past 15 years. She said all 3 of them had left without much explanation. In their 3rd month, Dana and Paul came home from a weekend trip to find that someone had walked their property while they were gone. They could tell because the padlock on their storage barn had been opened and closed. It was a combination lock, and they had found it hanging differently than they had left it. And there were boot prints in the soft soil near their back porch that were not theirs. Nothing was missing. Nothing was damaged. But someone had walked their property and looked at their things and left. Paul confronted Earl Holt at the fence the following morning. Earl listened to the accusation with the same unsmiling stillness his son had. He said he hadn't been on their property. He said, if they were accusing his family of something, they should be careful. He said good fences made good neighbors. And if the Ericksons had concerns about their security, they should attend to their own locks better. He turned and walked away. The walking of the property happened twice more over the following 2 months. Each time, nothing was taken. Each time, the evidence was subtle. A gate left slightly open, a tool moved in the barn, footprints that did not belong to them. Dana filed a report with the county sheriff's office after the second incident. The deputy who came out spoke to both families and noted the report. He told Dana and Paul privately that the Holts were well known in the county and that disputes with the Holt family tended to be resolved most smoothly by the incoming party, adjusting their expectations of what rural neighborly relations looked like. Dana was furious. She told the deputy that adjusting her expectations did not address the fact that someone was walking her property without permission. The deputy said he understood and would note her concern. The final incident happened in October. Dana woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of their dog barking in a sustained and specific way that she had learned to distinguish from regular nighttime noise. The bark of a dog that had located something specific and was not letting it go. She woke Paul, and he went to the back window and looked out. Travis Holt was standing in their backyard, not near the fence, not at the boundary. In the middle of their backyard, 30 feet from the house, in the dark, looking at the back of the house. The motion sensor light had not triggered. He had approached from an angle that avoided it, which meant he knew where it was and how it was positioned. Paul called 911. He kept Travis in sight through the window. Travis did not move for 7 minutes, standing in the yard looking at the house while Paul watched him from the window, and then he turned and walked back toward the fence line just before the sheriff's cruiser came down the road. The deputy found nothing. Travis was back on Holt property before the cruiser arrived. There was no evidence of trespassing beyond Dana and Paul's account and the dog's continued agitation. They listed the property for sale the following week. They sold it 4 months later at a slight loss because they priced it to move and they needed to move. The buyers were a young couple relocating from Atlanta. Dana thought about telling them. She has thought about that decision many times since. She ultimately said nothing beyond disclosing the property's physical condition as required. She tells the story now because she thinks certain things need to be said about the particular vulnerability of rural isolation. The distance from help. The way that a neighbor in the country is not the same as a neighbor in the city. They are not one of dozens. They are the ones who share your fence, your road, your night sounds, your entire immediate world. She says the thing that stays with her most clearly is Travis in the backyard at 2 a.m. Not running, not hiding, not doing anything that she could specifically name as a threat. Just standing in the dark in the middle of their backyard looking at their house. She says she has never been able to decide what he was looking at specifically. She says she is glad she does not know. The apartment below. Location: Brooklyn, New York, 2022. This story was told by a woman named Sophie Chen, 29, a UX designer who had lived in the same 5-story walk-up in Brooklyn for 3 years before the events of this story began. She lived in apartment 3B, a 1-bedroom on the 3rd floor with good light and an acceptable commute, and a landlord who fixed things in a reasonable time frame, which in Brooklyn counted as luxury. She had good relationships with most of her neighbors, the older couple in 3A who occasionally left homemade soup outside her door, the young family in 4B whose daughter had taken to waving at Sophie from the hallway with the full commitment of a 3-year-old who has decided you are important. The apartment below hers, 2B, had turned over several times during her 3 years in the building. A rotation of young professionals and students who stayed a year and moved on. In March 2022, a new tenant moved into 2B. She heard the moving, the familiar sounds of furniture being shifted on the floor below, and thought nothing of it. She assumed the new tenant would be another young professional, and that their relationship would be the standard Brooklyn apartment building relationship, a nod in the hallway, a brief exchange at the mailboxes, and otherwise parallel lives conducted in comfortable anonymity. She was right about the anonymity. She was wrong about the comfortable part. She did not meet the new tenant for the first 3 weeks. She heard them occasionally, movement in the apartment below, which was normal in a building with wood floors and reasonable acoustics. She heard footsteps, occasionally heard what sounded like furniture being rearranged, occasionally heard a television. Normal sounds of an occupied apartment. In the 4th week, she began to notice a pattern in the footsteps. Her apartment had a specific layout that she knew well. The kitchen was at the front, the living room in the middle, the bedroom at the back. The apartment below mirrored this layout. She began noticing that the footsteps in the apartment below moved in a specific pattern relative to where she was in her own apartment. When she was in the kitchen, she heard footsteps in the kitchen area below. When she moved to the living room, the footsteps moved to the living room area below. When she went to her bedroom at night, the footsteps moved to the bedroom area below. She noticed it consciously for the first time on a Wednesday evening. She was in the living room reading, and she had heard footsteps below move from the front of the apartment to the living room area. She stood up and walked to the kitchen. The footsteps below moved to the kitchen area. She stood very still in her kitchen, and the footsteps below stopped. She walked back to the living room slowly. The footsteps below moved back to the living room. She stood in the middle of her living room and looked at the floor and felt a cold, specific clarity about what was happening. Someone in the apartment below was tracking her movements through the ceiling. She told herself she was wrong. She told herself the acoustics of old buildings created audio illusions, and she was pattern matching because she was alone, and it was a Wednesday night, and pattern matching was what human brains did. She went to bed and resolved to pay less attention. She paid more attention. Over the following 2 weeks, she tested it repeatedly, and the pattern held every time. Move to a different room. Footsteps below. Move to the corresponding space. Stand still. Footsteps stop. Walk slowly. Footsteps pace her slowly. She began varying her movements, going to the kitchen, and then immediately back to the bedroom, standing in the hallway, moving in ways that did not follow a logical domestic pattern. The footsteps below followed every variation. She had not yet seen the tenant in 2B. She had heard them, but not seen them. She did not know if they were a man or a woman, young or old, what they looked like or who they were. She mentioned it to the older couple in 3A, framed as a casual question about whether they had noticed anything odd about the new downstairs neighbor. The husband, a man named Mr. Osei, who had lived in the building for 11 years, went quiet when she described the pattern. He said he had not noticed anything specific, but that the previous tenant in 2B, a young woman who had moved out abruptly after 7 months, had complained to the landlord about feeling watched in her apartment. He said the landlord had dismissed it as adjustment anxiety. Sophie went to the landlord. She described the pattern carefully and specifically. The landlord said old buildings had unusual acoustics and sound carried in unpredictable ways. Sophie said she understood that and described the tests she had done, the deliberate variations, the immediate correspondence between her movements and the movements below. The landlord said he could not act on a noise complaint that was not a noise violation. She asked if she could know anything about the tenant in 2B. He said he could not share tenant information. She installed a white noise machine in her bedroom. The footsteps still moved to her bedroom when she went to sleep. The white noise machine was not relevant. Whoever was below was not using sound to locate her. She put down heavier rugs. She changed how she moved through her apartment, trying to be lighter on her feet, less regular, less predictable. None of it changed the pattern below. She started sleeping at a friend's apartment several nights a week. She started leaving her television on in the living room when she was in the bedroom to create a misleading sound source. She became, in her own words, a person managing the floor plan of her own home as a security measure. She noted which rooms she felt most exposed in and avoided them. She stopped walking to the kitchen at night for water because the kitchen was directly above the 2B kitchen, and she did not want to be tracked there in the dark. In the 8th week, she finally saw the tenant in 2B. She was coming home from work, and the door to 2B opened as she was passing it in the hallway. A man came out, mid-30s, unremarkable appearance, average height. Nothing about him that would have made her look twice on the street. He looked at her. She looked at him. He said, "Hi." She said, "Hi." He went to the mailboxes, and she went up the stairs. She stood in her apartment for a moment. She thought about the face she had just seen. The ordinary face of a person who had been tracking her movements through the ceiling of his apartment for 2 months. She thought about what that looked like from below, standing under her ceiling and pacing her as she moved from room to room, stopping when she stopped, following when she moved, doing it night after night with the patience and consistency that spoke to a deliberate practice rather than an accidental habit. She called her best friend and described the man's face. Then she called her landlord and gave formal written notice that she was terminating her lease early, citing a habitability concern, and provided documentation of the pattern of behavior she had observed over 8 weeks. The landlord did not respond substantively. She moved out 6 weeks later. She moved to a ground-floor apartment in a different neighborhood. Ground floor specifically, because she did not want to be above anyone. She put rugs down everywhere immediately. She has lived there for 2 years without incident. She says the experience changed her relationship with her own home in a way that took a long time to repair. The idea that her apartment, her private space, the place where she moved freely and without performance, was being observed not through a window or a camera, but through the floor beneath her feet. That the simple act of walking from her kitchen to her bedroom at 10 p.m. was information that someone was collecting. She says she has thought about what someone does with that information. The pattern of a woman's movements in her own apartment. When she goes to bed, when she gets up, when she is in the kitchen, when she is in the living room, when she moves unpredictably, and when she moves in ways that suggest she is settling in for the night. She says she knows what that information is useful for. She says she hopes the woman who moved into 3B after her was loud enough on her feet that the pattern was impossible to follow. She says she hopes that. She is not certain of it. Be aware of who lives beside you, below you, and above you. Not with fear, but with the quiet, steady attention of someone who knows that the walls between us are thinner than we like to believe.